Hello, and welcome to this webinar from EdQuarter in conjunction with Rensair. My name is James Higgins, and I'm a reporter here at The Title. Today, we are demystifying air purification, or at least we really hope that we can, because it's a complex area and one that I'm sure many in education will want to gin up on. Now, the idea of improving air purification probably came onto the radar of many in the education sector this August, when 7 trade unions wrote to the government calling on them to invest in better technology to help reduce the risk of COVID transmission in schools. But as I said, it's a complex area. There's lots of technology on the market. So to explain how these things work, why they should be good investments for schools, I'm joined by 2 guests who I will introduce to you both very shortly. But before I do, let me introduce where they're from. Rensair has been around for 20 years, and they've primarily worked with hospitals during those 2 decades. Their technology has been developed and independently patented, and they have seen it all verified independently by scientific research. So they are experts in this field and absolutely brilliantly qualified to tell us all about this field of technology. So let me introduce first Christian Hendrickson, who is the co-founder and chief executive of Rensair, and Edward Woolston, who is the co-founder and managing director at Rensair. Thank you both for joining me. So, I've sort of mentioned already that several trade unions made this a priority, or said this was a priority for government to invest in. And statistics from the Office for National Statistics show that 1 in 14 school-aged children at the beginning of October was off school, missing school because of COVID. So clearly the risk has not completely disappeared, and countries in Europe are unfortunately predicting 4th waves. So Edward, let's think about first a bit of the science. How is COVID-19 transmitted?
And thanks for the introduction. So basically, what I'm going to say is based on science, on data. It's not my opinion. It's the latest research, and that comes from all the stuff we read and also our interactions with NHS microbiologists. What we know is that COVID is transmitted through airborne particles. It's either large particles that infected particles end up in your nose, throat, mouth, upper side. That causes, research shows, minor illnesses. And then much smaller particles called aerosols that can linger in the air for hours in a fully ventilated room. If you inhale those and they penetrate the lung, that causes the much more serious illnesses because you aren't providing oxygen to the rest of the body, and then the other organs start to struggle. So it's mainly through those 2. There was a lot of debate at the beginning about you being able to catch COVID off touching a surface. The WHO on their website, they have said that even though infected particles can remain alive on surfaces for a long time, there is still no direct report or evidence that you can catch COVID off touching a surface. Indeed, the US CDC, they put that probability at 1 in 10,000, so very, very small. So even the WHO now have prioritized the airborne transmission as the main way that you can catch it.
And is the risk of COVID-19 falling at the moment? Or, what's the sort of state of play in terms of the gauging the risk?
I think the way you need to look at it is in terms of catching it versus dying from it. So the risks of catching it have not changed. In fact, new variants show that it's more transmissible, the rate of transmissibility is going up. And we're seeing that, right? We're seeing that the number of COVID infections and people with COVID is going up. Now, we deal with countries, in countries all over the world, and we're seeing huge differences. And you'll have seen that in Europe, some countries are going back into lockdown. So whilst people are no longer dying of COVID like they used to because of the success of the vaccination, people are still catching COVID, and people are still becoming sick, in some cases, hospitalization, certainly a lot of absenteeism from work. So COVID is still around. And I saw yesterday the Department of Health said that they're beginning to look at annual vaccinations against COVID So it's definitely not going away, at least not in the short term.
You mentioned already the WHO. Could you give us a bit of a summary as to what the WHO and SAGE as well advise in terms of mitigating the risk of COVID?
Yeah. Well, it's a 4-step process. The first one is to test. If you take people with COVID out of the equation, then you won't get the transmission. The second one is to ventilate. So what we know is that in poorly ventilated spaces, these airborne aerosols can remain up in the air. Some research shows 36 hours, but the reality is, it's from the research we've seen, it's 2 to 8 hours. You build up a large amount of airborne particles, and if you don't do anything with that, it just gets more and more, and then you get a higher risk. So therefore, that's why they say ventilate. So you bring fresh air in, you take existing air out, and then if you can't do that, WHO, the US CDC, the HSE all say then purify the air, because that's a substitution. The third thing is to wear masks. And that basically stops the person exhaling the large droplets, those large droplets going on to someone else. And the fourth one, still, but it's become far less important. The US CDC or the HSC in the UK, they've really reduced the role of cleaning surfaces. So it's gone from cleaning surfaces, nothing else, to now it's test trace, masks, and ventilate. Those are the 3 priorities now.
Obviously, test is sort of outside of the realm of education providers to sort of organise, but certainly some of those other areas they do have responsibility for. You mentioned there that ventilation is one part of the solution. Obviously, in winter, harder to achieve, and masks too. But we know that can inhibit learning and can change the learning atmosphere for students. So I suppose thinking about those 2 things, and then you mentioned that purification could perhaps be a sort of a backup plan almost. It could be part of the solution if those 2 things can't be implemented. So could you provide a bit more of an explanation as to why purification might be part of that solution?
Well, if we go back to ventilation, right, you need to bring fresh air in and exhale the existing air. There are issues with that, because not everyone could put in an HVAC system, or an HVAC system costs hundreds of thousands of pounds, and it takes a year, getting hold of the parts and everything else. But that is definitely your number one thing. The problem with opening windows is, you say, it's cold. And you're not only bringing cold air, but then you're making all the surfaces cold. So the result of that is that your heating costs are going to go through the roof. And we're seeing that, and obviously carbon footprints and everything else. So because you can't ventilate everywhere, then that is why the WHO and everyone else says you can purify the air, because we know that's doing exactly the same thing. It's reducing all the particles in the air, taking them out and putting them in, through filtration. So that is basically it. So the problem that we've faced, or a lot of clients face, is they don't know how much to do it, because there's no guidelines. If you look at the eight pages on ventilation on the HSE, or if you look at US CDC and all these other places, that they just say ventilate. But what we know, and we've been doing this right from day one, is we've been saying provide 10 litres of fresh or purified air per person per second, because we know that amount will substantially reduce any particles in the air. But we also know that even providing 5 litres is already really mitigating the risk of airborne transmission, because you're really reducing. Now, we've been doing that for 18 months, recommending that. The WHO in May this year, they came out with recommendations, and they said 10 litres per second per person. So that has now become the guidelines that people are really beginning to accept. And you just build a solution based on the number of people in a room, the size of the room, and that way you can then really mitigate the risks. So our golden standard is 10 litres of fresh, and if you can't do fresh, purified air per person per second. And there's a lot of research which is behind that, which justifies this number.
And I'll just remind everyone that's watching that if you have any questions, and I anticipate that many of you will, because it is an interesting, complicated area, please do not hesitate to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll be able to put them to Christian and Edward at the end of our time. I mean, we've talked about there some of the guidance that's shifted over time. I think that's probably a fair way to represent it. And as a journalist during the COVID pandemic, a lot of my time was spent trying to work out exactly what the advice was to different people at different points. So Edward, could you give us a bit of an overview of what that shifting government advice has looked like in schools and colleges and universities, and of course in different parts of the UK, because there has been some slightly different advice in different parts?
Well, look, I've got 3 kids. I've got 2 kids at university and 1 at school. And right at the beginning, I saw them using foggers, putting chemicals everywhere, cleaning surfaces, spending all this money despite the lack of, no evidence that you can catch COVID off the surface still. That doesn't mean you can't do it, but now everyone's recognizing that's right. There are still a lot of people spending all this money cleaning surfaces. But what you can see is, for example, on the HSE website, which had pages and pages on how to clean everything. And we all remember people, even supermarkets, cleaning their fruit and all of that before they put it in their basket. So it's gone from all of that to now ventilation. So, and testing and tracing. So there's been this huge shift because people now recognize, or the authorities recognize, how COVID is transmitted. And so now that we know how it's transmitted, that way the advice has shifted from cleaning surfaces to actually ventilating, test and trace and masks. And that's, we have a lot of people who don't know some of this stuff still, who call us up. They're still spending a lot of money on cleaning surfaces and things like that. But we think that, there's a really good balance now.
And I mean, educational settings are very diverse. Universities will themselves, their campuses will include a variety of different settings. So what might the unique challenges be to somebody who's running a school, running a university, when thinking about how to mitigate the risk on their campus?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real challenge. I mean, we have our, units in schools, universities from the US, Australia, everywhere, plenty in the UK. And, I've taken my kids to university and I've seen the diverse set of buildings that you have. You've got these brand spanking new offices with great ventilation, and then you've got, Victorian buildings, and then you have density problems. You've got a lot of people in a school. And the other thing that is clear is that whilst we see in certain countries, like, for example, Germany or Italy, there are grants to help people with the ventilation aspect or purification, that isn't as generous. I mean, there are grants in the UK. If you have more than 3,000 people, then you can apply for some grants and stuff. But certainly the funding is a very big issue, of course, because it costs money to put in an HVAC system or buy air purifiers. And then the final thing, I guess, going back to this density thing, if you've got 30 students in a school classroom, that's a lot of air you need to ventilate or clean. And people go, oh, well, how do I achieve, all of this air cleaning? And what we show is, our experiences with hospitals, it's all about risk mitigation. You cannot take no risks, because even, not getting out of bed in the morning is a risk in itself. So it's all about risk mitigation. And we know that, as I said before, and there's really good research by Dr. Catherine Oakes at Leeds University on this, we know that even providing 5 litres is better than 10. And this is what we see in the NHS, in wards. If they can't achieve the 4 air changes per hour or whatever, they know that 1 is better than 4. And so this is what we always do with schools, is we say, okay, how can we mitigate the risk? Because you've got a huge diverse set of buildings, and try and fit it within a budget to reduce the risk. You're never going to be risk-free, and it is about taking risk, but taking the right amount of risk is the optimum thing.
So are there perhaps certain settings within a school or a university that perhaps should be the priority for investing in this technology?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you go from the worst ventilated, higher density so for example, sports halls, large open areas, the risk of particle concentration is really, really small. So there's no point ventilating or purifying air. But in densely packed classrooms, absolutely, that's where you do it. Or common rooms. You know, I saw in schools that actually the outbreaks were happening in common rooms because you get lots of people very close, not sitting at desks spaced apart. You know, it's things like that. But likewise, what we say is if you're putting an air purifier in a classroom with no ventilation, between lessons, open the window, then close it, because then you're also helping the process. So it is all about finding a tailor-made solution for each specific location. But the key thing is to understand all the basics, and then you can build from that, because actually the basics are basic, and you can work out what all these are and then build a very good long-lasting solution.
Okay. And has COVID identified more general issues about the quality of our air that we are breathing in our schools and universities?
So there's a very good scientific paper done by four researchers. They looked at every single indoor air quality research ever published, and they found that there are only 2 that were peer-reviewed and done in proper settings. 2 in the history of scientific journals. It's quite extraordinary. There are hundreds of indoor researches, but they were done very poorly. They showed 2. But in the last 12 months, they're coming out on a weekly basis. And what we're seeing is that people are beginning to move away just from COVID, and they're realizing the importance of not only CO2, but even particulate matter, more importantly, effect it has on lungs, cognitive power, you know, and all these things. So, you know, we saw a really good quip the other day, which was, you know, we expect clean water, we expect clean food, we should expect clean air. And whilst the first 2 are highly regulated, you know, indoor air quality is not as highly regulated. The US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, you know, they note that we spend 90% of our time indoors, and indoor air can be 2 to 5 times dirtier than outdoor air. So absolutely, clean air, and it's not just COVID, but clean air is becoming a much, much bigger issue, and we've noticed a huge change in the last, you know, year on this.
Interesting you mentioned that, because in fact there was some research sent to me yesterday by Cambridge University. A study was published in Clinically Infectious Diseases, and I think that article is actually open access, so you can access it if you don't have a subscription. But they did a study where they put air filtration purification systems in surge wards in Adam Brooks Hospital, and found that they significantly, I mean, the numbers are all there, but I know in Japan, but it was a significant reduction. And in fact, I think on 5 of the days they measured, there was no trace of COVID in the air, despite the fact that the room was full of people with COVID-19. So yeah, an emerging field of study, and it's one that there is a lot of pace behind at the moment. So Christian, then, we've talked about the scale of the problem and the challenges. So that's sort of there now. But in terms of the air purification solutions that are on the market, there are quite a few. How do they work?
So I think first of all, and Edward have alluded to it already, but you have 3 ways of improving air quality. You have dilution, which is essentially like bringing in fresh air, and that can be done through windows, so that's natural ventilation. It can be done through mechanical ventilation, so a built-in HVAC system, and then you have air purification. And air purification is there, you know, a number of advantages. For instance, that, you know, in the winters here in the UK, it's very cold to have windows open. That's why we want to have an alternative solution. Likewise with mechanical ventilation, if you don't have a built-in modern HVAC system in your building, it's typically very expensive and often difficult to install a central HVAC system. And that's why air purification becomes important, especially portable air purifiers. In portable air purifiers, you can divide the technology into 2 sections. So you have subtractive technologies and additive technologies. Subtractive is characterized by removing particles from the air, and that's a filter. And remember, a filter, like for instance, you know, we use a HEPA H13 filter. That's a medical grade filter. That is essentially a fine net of fibers that removes particulates from the air as air travels through. So that's, you know, definition of a subtractive technology. With additive technologies, you are adding other elements into the air. That can be ionizers, so that's where you're sending negatively loaded ions into the air. They attract to particles, and that makes them drop to the floor. And there are a number of alternative solutions, also, for instance, using chemicals, etc. And what we've seen, and where a lot of guidance has also come out during the pandemic, is really that all authorities are recommending using the subtractive technologies. And that boils down to essentially you have two options. It is HEPA filtration or other high quality filtration or high quality filters, and UVC light. It's interesting, especially in the US, but also to an increasing degree here in Europe. We've seen governments, and for instance in the US, ASHRAE, that is the main ventilation body, are extremely adamant about do not use additive technologies like ionizers, like plasma technology, like titanium dioxide oxidation, because they add particles into the air, and it's not well enough understood what the long-term health effects are of then being exposed to these particulates. So therefore, the clear recommendation, Sage wrote a brilliant report reviewing portable air purifiers back in the fall, and it was the same conclusion they drew then. Go for the subtractive technologies, which really comes down to, again, HEPA filtration and UVC light.
So, I mean, we should be subtractive, not additive. But what is it about the additive solutions that don't work? Why are they not a good option?
They can work, but one example would be, for instance, a process that's commonly used, and you'll see in a lot of air purifiers on the market, is ionization. And again, ionizers is you send essentially is an electric current. You send electrically negatively loaded ions into the air, and they attach to these particles, and that makes them drop to the floor. And while that has it can work, there is very limited scientific and independent evidence of it actually working to the degree you expect. So it's been proven to work in lab environments, very rarely in real life environments, but also by inhaling these particles, we don't know enough about what the health effects are. So therefore, in the States, we've now seen here in the education sector specifically, a lot of school districts in the US bought ionizers early on in the pandemic, and that's now resulted in a large amount of lawsuits happening in the States against these companies, because you're actually exposing, yes, you may be mitigating or trying to mitigate one risk, but you're actually adding another risk into the environment. And that's why, broadly speaking, and again, following, for instance, Sage recommendations, avoids additive technologies.
There's an experiment underway at the moment, which I'm sure you're aware of, in Bradford. The University of Leeds is overseeing the installation of purifiers into 30 primary schools. They're using the HEPA and the UVC that you've just mentioned. Do we know which of those two solutions is better?
It wouldn't be right to say which one is better, because they are very different, but they can complement each other extremely well. So HEPA filters is again an extremely fine grid of essentially glass fiber, and that removes, or is very effective at removing, particulate matter from the air. Particulate matter would also include aerosols, so the carriers that would include viruses or bacteria, but also things like mold spores, etc., which we may find in the air. So HEPA filters remove particulate matter from the air. UVC light is a specific wavelength of light that's very effective at killing all cells, all living cells, and that includes bacteria and viruses. So UVC is really a technology that's focused on inactivating pathogens, and that can be done extremely effectively. But if you install a UV only solution, you're only going to be focused on the pathogen reduction. You're not going to improve the overall air quality from a particulate matter standpoint. And that's why, as Edward mentioned, with for instance, the cognitive results, we see, very clear correlation between cognitive ability and air quality, and that is directly linked to the essentially particulate matter level in the air. You wouldn't get those benefits purely from using UVC. So while the experiment at Bradford, is brilliant, and it's great that there's more research being done in real life situations, a challenge from our, perspective would be that while it's great that they've used both HEPA and UVC, you shouldn't set them up as either or, because they serve different purposes and therefore should be addressed as such. And I've seen from some of the questions in the chat that, how is how does the Rensair work? What we have is a patented solution where we essentially use the HEPA filtration to remove all particulates from the air, including aerosols that could contain viruses and bacteria. And then we use UVC light to continuously sterilize our filter, so anything that's caught is being killed, and that's why they can complement each other very well.
So yeah, you can bring the best of both worlds. I will just remind everyone that's watching that we will have time at the end for questions, so please do send some in to us, and we have a few already, but we'll have plenty of time to get through as many as possible. So Christian, I mean, we've started to outline what the solutions are, why they work, but I mean, I'm sure there are probably a lot of senior leaders sitting in their offices right now thinking, right, well, if I'm going to go for this, what is it that I should be buying? And how do I know that I'm buying the right thing? And how do I ask the right questions? How do I interrogate what's being offered to me? I mean, what advice do you have to those people? How do they ensure that they are getting the right thing and it's going to have the desired impact?
And that is a great question. That's where, unfortunately, this is a complicated space, because there are a lot of products on the market that make claims based on theoretical specifications of components rather than the actual performance of a product in a real life situation. But I would go back to the SAGE report that I mentioned earlier, where they did a review of what should you look for when doing or looking at portable air purifiers as means to improving air quality. And what the SAGE committee basically recommended was only use the recommended technologies, which are the subtractive technologies, as mentioned earlier, which boils down to HEPA and UVC light. And then, very importantly, only go for devices that have been thoroughly independent validated. And what I mean by that is it's easy to put an air purifier together, because the definition of an air purifier is such a fan and a filter. But actually ensuring that it works, ensuring that it creates air circulation in a room, ensuring that it actually removes particulate matter from the air to the extent you would expect from for instance, a HEPA H13 filter. The definition of a HEPA 13 filter, it's an ISO classification, and it means that you can remove at least 99.97% of particulate matter on a single air pass for particles at 0.3 microns. So it's a very technical definition, but just because that is the spec of the component you use doesn't mean that the product performs to that degree. And that's unfortunately also where, from our experience and from having worked in this space for a long time, we see that is the case. So really, two things: subtractive technologies and then independent validation of the products that are going to be implemented, because that's the only way you can ensure that they actually work.
And are there going to be long-term benefits to installing this sort of technology after COVID eventually, can't wait, disappears from our kind of radar?
No, absolutely. You can say, obviously, COVID has highlighted, and obviously the world came to a halt because of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but we have seasonal flu, we have common colds, we have a lot of other airborne diseases that we've learned to live with, but they can obviously be addressed using the exact same technology. They spread by the air, and therefore they are, by definition, a ventilation issue. So there's certainly other health benefits. But again, going back to the research that also Edward mentioned, cognitive ability and learning ability is directly correlated with air quality. So there will be a big difference in a classroom that sits next to a congested road versus one in the middle of the countryside, all else equal. And therefore that can be addressed by installing proper air filtration, because that's also one of the challenges with simply opening the windows. If you are in central London, where we know air quality is bad and particulate levels are above levels that are recommended, well, that will also affect learning abilities, and that can't be addressed by simply having a open windows. This is Edward, you can tell the story, but this is essentially running at a school for a couple of weeks. Edward, you're muted.
This was a school in southwest London. They operated this unit for 3 weeks, of which one was half term. And that is the dust on the pre-filter. So that's before you even get to the filter. And frankly speaking, we were a bit shocked by this, because this school is not near a main road. It's not near any industrial complex or anything else. And to see that amount of dust accumulate in effect 2 weeks was truly shocking to us. But that gives you an idea. And this is not dust from the floor. This is from the air. And this is stuff that you cannot see, but over time accumulates in the pre-filters.
Yeah.
I think that the last point to add, we also know a lot of the older buildings have issues with, for instance, mold. Mold can be very, bad for asthmatics, and I experienced that myself. So therefore, removing that from the air as well is really something that can have a very significant impact on people's lives. Not to mention the pollen season, which is also obviously hardly affecting. So.
And obviously, I mean, there are all the usual seasonal colds and flus and all the other infections that often end up going around schools this time of year. I mean, that's the sort of health benefit. But is there going to be, I suppose, a return on investment, you could call it? What's the kind of financial case for doing this beyond the obvious important infectious control issues?
Again, it's about providing first of all, a safe working environment. That includes obviously both staff, but also children in school, and that can certainly be done. And I think looking at this in the context of saying what are the alternatives, if you can't have windows open continuously, and you are looking then at sort of mechanical ventilation options, portable air purifiers can be done at a fraction of the cost of trying to overhaul the central HVAC system. So no, it can certainly be done in a cost-effective way, and therefore if you actually look at the investment in a classroom, and as Edward mentioned, like while the WHO standard, SIPSI standard now is 10 liters per second per person, we know that even if you can get to 5, it's much better, and you've provided a significant degree of risk mitigation as opposed to doing nothing. So even by doing something, putting one air purifier, for instance, a high quality air purifier in a room, will significantly mitigate risk and have these health benefits. So it can be done in a cost-effective way. And again, if you can then at the same time help increase the learning ability of people in the institution, then really that is something worth considering.
And that really echoes what Edward was saying about, you can't eliminate risk entirely, but you can certainly take intelligent steps to reduce the highest risks where they occur in a school. So it's about making sure that you identify the most at-risk areas. I'll remind everyone again, we have had a few questions in from people already, but please do send some questions in, because I know that Edward and Christian would be more than happy to help answer any of those questions. Edward, I know that you had a few graphs. I wondered if you wanted to show those to us before we move on to questions at the end.
So I guess to explain what we were saying before, which is crucial especially for schools because of the budget constraints and the density. But I think these charts here, which come from the SAGE committee, explain the situation very well. Firstly, you need to take into account what people are doing. So these are the particles emitted by people doing different things. So breathing is the left, and then you've got exercise 3 from the left. And it's a log scale. So you can see that instead of emitting 0 to 100 particles, you're emitting 10 to 10,000. So that's why, we discussed this with them, that actually 10 liters per second, it depends what you're doing. And if you look on the HSE website, they also mention about, different exercises need different ventilation rates. But this is the key one, I think. This from Leeds University, it shows that if you don't ventilate, which is the blue line, you have over time an increase in relative concentration of particles. This is for a 300 cubic meter room with 20 people in it. And you can see the effect of ventilating 5 liters per second substantially reduces the concentration. 10 is even better, but actually you're making a big difference by just doing 5. Whilst the one below, which is the big sports hall, we get called by a lot of cinemas and big places, and we show them this chart and we say, look, your concentration is never going to be, even though you've got 8 times as many people as in the classroom above, you're never going to have a concentration of particles, so there's no point ventilating. Think about the adjacent rooms where you will have a higher density. So therefore, what we say is build a solution which is based on the occupancy, the size of the room, what people are doing in the room, and taking into account any existing ventilation. And that's basically, to find the right solution. And that solution should be a solution for the long term. Because once you put it in now, it should be a good long-lasting thing that will work for the future.
So perhaps instead of ventilating a sports hall, we'd better to focus on the changing rooms or a small squash court or something along those lines.
Not even the squash court, it's 2 people in a massive space, but absolutely the changing rooms. Or the bars, cafeterias, things like that, or common rooms. That's where the real issues are.
Thank you for that. Right, so we have some time for some questions, but before we do talk about that, Rensair has produced a white paper, and it would be remiss of me not to mention it. So if you would like a copy of it, please email Edward, who is on our screen at the moment, at ejb@rensair.com. I'll share that email in the chat. I will also, whilst I'm on it, share the link to that University of Cambridge study that I mentioned at the very beginning. As I said, it's an open access report, and you can read that at your leisure. So let's take a first question. Now, I think, Christian, you did slightly answer this one already, but let's do it again. Someone has asked if you could explain how Rensair technology works. So let's go over that again and talk about how you combine those 2 different technologies together.
Sure. Our technology was developed for use in hospitals. Hospitals are also often in old buildings that are underventilated relative to modern standards. And therefore, rather than going through the same exercise of upgrading the central HVAC system, portable air purifiers is a viable alternative, as long as they can be proven to do what they're supposed to do. So we developed our air purifiers particularly for use in hospital wards in Denmark originally. We combine, again, HEPA filtration and UVC light. And we essentially use the exact same principle as you would have in a duct system leading into an operating theater. You would use a medical grade filter to stop airborne bacteria and viruses on that filter surface. But using the filter alone means that any airborne pathogen you're stopping would sit on that filter, and it's well documented that bacteria and viruses can live on filter surfaces for long periods of time. So what we did, and again, what you do typically in ducts, in hospitals, is you then put UVC light in, you continuously illuminate that same filter surface, and thereby you are continuously inactivating any pathogen that would live on that filter surface, making the whole installation sterile. The advantage of that is also that you can use UVC light to just produce what's called a flyby kill. So where you essentially calculate the wind speed in an air duct, and then you put enough UVC light in to ensure that it's inactivated by the time the particle travels by. That requires much higher energy consumption and much more maintenance, which is all else equal just a more expensive procedure, and it doesn't remove the particulate matter. But therefore, what we do with the Rensair unit is we have a unit that pulls air in, air goes through a HEPA filter that removes all particulate matter, including the aerosols, and our UVC light inactivates them. And that's patented technology to us, and that's where it's one of the big differentiators between the products you'll find on the market. Combine that with the strong independent validation we needed in order to sell to Danish hospitals back in the day, and now to the NHS. We're a large supplier to NHS hospitals across the country, and that is because we have the independent validation. So when we speak with infection prevention teams at hospitals, they go through our data. That's their first question. They see what results we have, and that's essentially the proof they need that this is an effective solution and a real alternative to other forms of ventilation.
Britta asked, is it possible to clean the air pre-filter? Edward, you've already answered and said yes, simple vacuum cleaning.
Yeah, it takes 2 seconds to vacuum clean, and you do it as and when you'll see from how dirty the air is in your room. Some places it might be a month, some places it might be 2 weeks. But it's a very quick process.
What is the general kind of maintenance procedure around a Rensair air purifier?
It's very simple. You just change the filter every 9,000 hours and the bulb. It's a very simple procedure. I wanted to just touch on what Eileen Flanagan's asked. Really interesting question. Is the optimum solution to combine air purification with some level of ventilation? So the guidelines are to ventilate. And that's what we say to everyone is if you can ventilate and you achieve your 10 litres per second per person with outside air, bang. I think 50% of, the corporate world, brand new spank new offices who call us, we actually tell them this, and then they find out that they're actually fine. They don't need to do anything. They've got brilliant ventilation, modern office buildings. They have perfect ventilation. There's no point doing anything. You're fine. You just don't know it, right? There is one issue, though, that we're becoming more and more wary about, and we're doing a study with a university on this. Is if you're providing 5 liters per person and you increase it to 10, you're doubling your energy costs. You're doubling your CO2 emissions and everything else. And actually, if you can achieve the right amount of oxygen at 2, 3, 4 liters per person per second, and then you do the rest with purification, which is just as effective in removing particulate matter and pathogens and everything else. A standard high quality air purifier will cost you 10p a day to run. It's very low energy consumption. So actually, yes, you should be trying to do 10 liters of fresh air per person per second. But if you're doing 3 and then the other 7 you're doing purification, you are reducing your energy bills substantially. And that's sort of, apart from, it will pay for the units themselves, but you are reducing your carbon footprint. Just to give you statistics, 60% of energy use is done in buildings, of which 70% is HVAC systems. That is a massive, massive carbon footprint. And this is why we're doing this study with this university, to try and actually work out the energy savings that you would do and the carbon footprint savings. It's a very complex thing we're doing. But if you think of it in those terms, well, actually, you can start thinking, well, if you ventilate to get the right oxygen level, then the rest you can do with purification.
Mm. How might that work in practice then in a school if you were trying to combine the two?
Well, a lot of schools we see don't have HVAC systems, full stop, so that's not an option for them. But what we do know is that by keeping your windows closed, you'll be saving a huge in thermal, so radiator costs.
What we can do and what we often do for clients is, for instance, with a large Irish university, we went through their mechanical ventilation system. And then we take into account how much fresh air are they providing through the mechanical ventilation system. And then we simply look at the difference between that and where they want to be, which in this case was 10 liters per second. So we only cover the gap, essentially. And that's where, again, it's a very flexible solution.
Now, there's a couple of questions. One from Britta there. How do you measure the right oxygen level? Who would like to? Well, there are 2 ways. Firstly, I think health authorities have scared people on CO2. Let's be frank here. I'll be a bit blunt. People haven't been dying of CO2 all over the country. You don't, right? CO2 is used as a proxy to understand whether you have good ventilation or not. And the HSE website is very clear there. They say if you get above 800 parts per million on a CO2 monitor, that's when your ventilation is bad. That doesn't mean people are going to die of CO2 poisoning. It just means your ventilation is bad. So the answer to that, Britta, is that you should be trying to have lower than 800 parts per million in any location. And I suppose that also sort of answers John Exton's question, which is why is the government supporting CO2 monitors to warn about COVID? And I assume it's therefore it's a proxy for how good your air is.
Exactly. It's got nothing to do with the dangers of CO2. It is all about understanding, do you have ventilation or not? So the study that we're going to be publishing very shortly, our units were used in an office as they went from 5% to 100% occupancy over a period of 4 weeks. They installed Rensair machines. What you see is the CO2 levels slowly increasing and actually going over this 800 parts per million. But the particulate matter stayed at 0 throughout the period. And that's the way to look at it as a solution.
There's a question from Mike Maitland. Will the pre-filter be potentially contaminated, and will the HEPA filter have to be considered the same when it comes to disposing of them?
So because what you see on the picture Edward showed before with the pre-filters, it's essentially just a fine grid, but not anywhere near as fine, needed to stop any aerosol transmission. So any aerosol would not attach to that grid, and therefore no, the filters won't become contaminated. What then happens is that the aerosols end up in the main HEPA filter, and the HEPA filter there, the C light will be continuously inactivating, which also means that and a big selling point to our devices, and why it's important is that the filter can be disposed of safely. So safe maintenance. And again, there are products on the market that are safe to handle, but it's just an important thing to consider from an operational perspective, that you don't just sort of centralize contamination and then whoever needs to perform the maintenance is exposed to that.
And just, I suppose, a little bit of a follow-up for me, Edward, you were talking about combining ventilation with purification. How, if a school, for example, were to put one in a common room, I mean, is there an efficient way in terms of how and when you should have that purifier on? Should it be on during all school hours, or just when people are using the room? Should it be on all the time? What's the kind of understanding around that?
Look, I mean, there's no point purifying air when there's no one there, right? There's a cost to purifying air. The replacement filters are expensive things. And what we do is we say to people, when you come in, turn them on. When you leave, turn them off, like the lights. And that way, instead of lasting a full year, the filter in a school, 180 days a year, will last you 4.5 years. So that way, you only need to change the filter then. In terms of placement, we've had some people ask us some pretty interesting questions about where to put them. The reality is you want to space them apart. You want them where there'll be proper airflow allowed, in and out of the unit. But what we know from the tests done in our units and validated by this recent study in an office block is that we create full air circulation, and therefore we clean all the air. But there's a lot of common sense involved, obviously.
Well, we have reached the end of our time, and I think we've answered all the questions that have currently been sent in to us, although I'm sure there are probably more. But if you do, I did put in the chat Edward's email. It's ejb@rensair.com. That's RENSAIR.com. So email him if you want to get a copy of that white paper, and I'm sure he can also update you with that piece of research that they're doing with the university, because I'm sure that'll be very interesting when that is released. But yeah, thank you very much, the pair of you, for joining me. And I think you've certainly answered a lot of people's questions. You've certainly taught me an awful lot. So thank you both. And please do not hesitate to reach out to them if you have any more questions.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Take care.